Again, this project began several years ago now, and has expanded and evolved, and has really become very, very interesting in terms of, I think, the process, number one, everything is correct, and also just some of the really interesting implications. One of the things about teaching Holocaust, and we're going to spend some time talking about this afternoon, is this idea of not to teach the numbers. You know, when I mentioned the numbers once and said we wouldn't mention again, the idea of individuals. And again, we're going to spend some time this afternoon looking at survivor testimony, and I think this is a really good example. What Irv's going to discuss with you is a really good example of this idea of how individuals are affected, individual families, and long-term, all kinds of different things. So Irv, it's all yours.
Okay. So, by the way, I'm a member of the temple here, and good for you that I am no longer the treasurer. Because one of the jobs of the treasurer is to ask for money. You don't have to worry about that. Okay. So I'm going to just pass this around. You can pass, pass it around here. But I may ask for money anyway. Then I have a book. I'll talk about that. And thanks a lot for giving me the opportunity to go over this stuff. So I call this project the Yellow Letter Project, and what I'm going to talk about now is I'm not going to go into the detailed presentation. Some of the folks here, like Dave and of course Carol and Fran. By the way, Carol and Fran, I could walk out of here. They can give this presentation. They know it so well. And Jeff has had the fast version of it, and I don't know if a couple of years ago I was at a symposium and I gave the full presentation, but it's been modified a little bit since then. So what this is a presentation about the presentation. Right? So it's mainly to kind of give you some insight about the things that I will talk about in more detail, so you can determine for yourself if you think this is something that you would like me to do some future date. And I provided my contact information. The actual talk of the presentation is tracing my Viennese roots after the Holocaust, but it's basically my story about the family members that survived and didn't survive, and how I found them. And the reason it's called the Yellow Letter Project is because, let's get this thing to work. Oh, here we go. Yeah, over here. It's because it's based on letters that I discovered that were written from my grandmother, mainly from my grandmother to my mother. There were 105 letters, and 91 of those letters are direct letters from my grandmother to my mother. And my grandmother was in Vienna, and she never got out. She was murdered at a place called Molly Trutzenitz, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. And then there were other family members that wrote letters to my mother also. So by using the letters, I could identify, and then, fortunately, through a lengthy process, which I'll describe briefly, I was able to find these family members, and these are people that I never knew ever existed. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail as to how I discovered these family members and what led me, and basically my history growing up. But basically the presentation goes through that. It kind of gives you the background as what started my journey, and what drove me, if you like, to try to find this thing out. And the presentation describes the journey. It gives really talks about the life under Nazi occupation through the eyes of my grandmother and others. In fact, interestingly enough, earlier this year, we have a friend of ours, and Dave knows her name is Dr. Elizabeth Anthony, and she runs the International Tracing Service at the U.S. Holocaust Museum, and has become a very good friend of ours. And she just recently got a PhD in Holocaust Studies in May in 2016 from Clark University. And we went to see her at the end of July, early August, and we're kind of going over the letters because I'm trying to figure out what to do with them. And then she, having the perspective she has, she took a 50,000 foot look at these things, and she basically said what's in these letters describes everything that happened to the Viennese Jews in Vienna. The Jews in Vienna. And once she mentioned that, then we knew we could maybe put together a book, and which is something I'll mention briefly later on. So why am I doing this? Okay, well, I'm doing it so I can stand in front of you and tell you about its story and history so you have a better idea of what happened in Vienna. People, when they think about the Holocaust, they don't think too much about Vienna. But Vienna is pivotal to the Holocaust. This is where Eichmann set up shop. All the deportation procedures, the model, it was all developed in Vienna. It's terrible, but it's true. Most of the perpetrators and most of the concentration camps, the heads of the major concentration camps, they were Viennese. I mean, it was just terrible. And people don't really know that. And the other thing, so this has now become much more fertile area for research. And so what I'm trying to do is get people to understand that there was 185,000 Jews basically in the city of Vienna, and 65,000 more or less never made it out. Also, this is to present Holocaust victims and survivors so that the stories are not forgotten. Basically, these people are dying off. So being a first-generation American, or they're like a second-generation Holocaust survivor, I think it's my job. I mean, that's what in terms of just, I owe this to my mother and my grandmother and other family members. By the way, every one of my family, they're all Viennese, and they all are survivors. They all left Vienna. Some of them didn't make it, and some of them did make it. So I look at it as my job to preserve my grandmother's memory for these family members as well as others, for my kids and my grandkids, and for just people along. So a lot of this work, I've had a tremendous amount of help being able to do this. And I mentioned some of these names briefly as I give this presentation, so you need to basically know who they are. Dr. Elizabeth Klampa, who is the archivist at the Documentation Center or Archive for Austrian Resistance, is very, very important. Joy Gieschen, Dave mentioned her name a few minutes ago. I mentioned Elizabeth Anthony a few minutes ago. Marianne Salinger and Michael Simonson, those were two people at the Leo Beck Institute in New York. They were able to help me get some of the letters translated. They're in this old-style German script called Koranschrift, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Carol Jackson, sitting here, who's been tremendously helpful, going forward, and going to continue to be very helpful. She's very heavily involved in this project now. Sue Ann Roberts, professor at IPFW, who's been tremendously helpful with me with my German. I have what I could say is quite good translation capability. I can't have dialogues. I'm not going to be able to do presentations in German, but I can read pretty well, especially with a dictionary. And that's helped me tremendously because a lot of the information that I've needed to get have been in scholarly publications. And then my wife, who has made some inputs to this, lots of inputs to this presentation, and is also very involved with me. She's a child of Holocaust survivors, and is also very interested in what's and if you have any questions, just interrupt me. No worries. So what I have here is a brief timeline. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but just kind of give you an idea of how this thing started and how it's progressing. 2010, we take a vacation. We wind up going to a place called the Documentation for Austrian Resistance, or DOG, the Israelitische Kultusgemeinde, which is the Jewish Community Center, and also the archive spent a lot of time there. We had a 5-day vacation. We spent almost 3 days going to these places, so it was less vacation than we thought. And then we came back and discovered the letters. Then we went to the first phase of the translation. This is where Joy helped us quite a bit. And she worked on the letters that were the penmanship with Lateinschrift, and you'll see what that looks like in a second. Then we put together, we started identifying all these names, and you'll see that in a second. And so the basic question is, who are these people? Because I never heard of them before. Then we met Elizabeth Anthony as part of this whole research project, and I cannot tell you how important that's been. And then we went to a translation of the letters phase 2, which is the Koranschrift, which was done by the Leo Beck folks. Then we identified, I got to know Betsy pretty well. She came back to the Holocaust Museum as the program manager for the International Tracing Service. And then we started looking for some of my family members. And the first ones we focused on was Max and Paul Spielman. I had more information on them. They showed up in the letters many times. And so we decided to look for them. Then there's a couple of things that happened that are incredibly serendipitous. The Stones of Remembrance ceremony, and then, which is how I discovered some of these folks are still alive. Contact with Benny Spielman, who's a relative of mine living in Huntington Woods. I'll tell you about him in a second. And then meeting Paul, who's Shaul, who's changed his name to Paul, who has a phenomenal history. I'll just touch on that. In Michigan and in Israel. And then meeting more family members that I discovered in October 2015 and May 17, and then in Australia in March 2016. So if you think we're traveling around all over the place, you're right. Okay. So we translate. Then we had the translation of letters phase 3. This is where Carol started getting involved. And again, I can't tell you what a great help that's been. And I'll mention that again. And then I gave a presentation November 15, 2015 at the Allen County Public Library, which was kind of that's when I started putting things together. And then just more recently we took a trip to Minsk and Mali Trustenes, and I'll talk about that and what the significance of that is. And then the last thing that I'm starting to do right now is I'm starting to work on a book. So I'm starting to pull things together. I've actually started some writing. Right now I'm doing some more historical research as to the time just after the Anschluss and prior to the time my mother left, as to why, you know, why did she decide to leave? All right. So briefly, we take this wonderful trip to Vienna, vacation. This is the Riesenrad. This is in a place called the Prater. It's in a park in Vienna. It's the first Ferris wheel in the world. Okay, it's late 1800s. It's what they call during the Belle Époque, the fin de siècle. It's the Art Nouveau, end of the 19th century, and sometime they had this thing called the Riesenrad. So we're out there taking a vacation. Turns out not to be a vacation. It turned out to be 2.5 days, almost 3 days worth of research in various locations. So then we come back from this vacation. I found out during this vacation about my grandmother. My brother told me that he thought that she died in Auschwitz. Well, it turns out she died at a place called Mali Trustenes. I talk quite a bit about Mali Trustenes. I'll mention it a little bit here. But Mali Trustenes is an extermination camp. Essentially, when you went to Mali Trustenes, it took a 5-day train ride from Vienna. You got off the train, you either were dead when you arrived, you got shot or gassed within 1 hour of the arrival, and they put you in a ditch. So that was Mali Trustenes, and that was very, sad to hear that. And then that started me doing more research. We came back, and I had this suitcase that had stuff in it, and I remembered that from some early discussions with my mother, which I go into more detail about. But I discovered that there's letters, and there's a lot of them. So I pulled them out, and I decided at that time that could be basically a diary of my mother's experience and my grandmother's experience in Vienna. And I'm showing here 2 of these letters. It's kind of important that you get a look at these. I hope it shows up here. There are 2 different penmanship styles. These are letters that are written in Latin script, which just looks like ordinary penmanship, okay? And these are letters that were written in something called Rundschrift, which is very stylized. It's the penmanship version of Gothic. And it was taught pretty much up to the 1930s, and then the Germans started switching over to teach a more modern style of penmanship. But in the late 30s, like 1930, end of 39, 1940, there was a Nazi edict that was put out that said all letters had to be written in Latin script. There's lots of reasons for that. It's like 4 reasons. I heard Hitler couldn't read Quran script. This Quran script was more Jewish writing. I think one of the big reasons is that at this time the letters were being censored, and frankly, the people who are reading the censors, the censors were like they're in their 20s, they couldn't read this stuff, okay? So I think that's my own personal opinion. I yet to discover any literature supporting that, but anyway, I can speculate. But that's actually quite important. And one of these letters talks about Sweet Paulie, okay? And it tells you a little bit about Sweet Paulie, how he was playing the violin. And this Sweet Paulie comes up many, many times. And it turns out this is Paul Spielman, and he has his family. His grandmother is Rosalie or Sally Spielman, and that's my great aunt, or my mother's sister. And his name is very, very prominent in the letters, and so we decided we're going to find Sweet Paulie. Okay, so Joy and I, this is the first big project, so Joy and I, we were going through these letters. Joy now she's in the process of finishing up her master's degree, and she needs to work on a project. In fact, actually, when a couple of months into this translation project, Joy came to Fran and I, we were sitting there, and she said, I'd like to ask you for a big favor. So would it be okay for you if I use these letters for my master's project? And we say, yay! You know, I mean, it's the best thing that could possibly happen. You get somebody now who's vested in this thing, who really wants to do something. So then and that led to a whole bunch of other things, but in translating the letters, Joy started identifying all these people that I never heard of. I mean, I'm growing up, and I know a lot of my family, but I have no idea who these people are. So, who are these people? And then that becomes the focus of a lot of the activity for the next couple of years. And so we go back to, this is happening like in 2011, and in early 2012 we decided we need to get more information, so we go to the US Holocaust Museum, and they say go meet Betsy Anthony. So in Vienna in June 2012, we're here, this is Fran, she's back there in case you don't recognize her. Joy is in Indianapolis, so you can only visualize her, she's been here right now. And then this is Betsy Anthony, who was here in Fort Wayne in 2015, and if I can get her back here, I'll try, but she's a fabulous speaker and very interesting. So we're working around a place called Alzebrund, which is which is the 9th district. It's an area, very nice area within Vienna. There's a large population of Jews, basically middle-class Jews. And what you see here is a memorial to the middle class, to these Jews that were deported and they never returned. So this is the famous key memorial. It's the Wittengasse. It's actually the keys of the apartments or the homes that were occupied by Jewish residents, and they never returned. Okay, so we started this search, and we used the International Tracing Service. I think this is something that you, as teachers, should know more about. I spent a little time on the presentation talking about it. It's very, basically it was started by the Red Cross in 1943 timeframe, and the Allies at this time were recognizing that given time that they were going to win the war, the Germans had recently defeated in Russia, and then it was just a matter of time. And they also realized that a lot of people were going to be looking for their displaced relatives. So in 1943 timeframe, they started it wasn't called the International Tracing Service, it was basically the Red Cross. And as the Allies were moving to the east, the Tracing Service picked up its office, which originated in London, and then moved further and further, eventually ending in a place called Bad Arolsen, and I talk about how that happened. That really allowed for family members to try to find their displaced relatives. Okay. So this is just a little, this is part of a whole series of correspondence, emails between myself and Betsy Anthony. Starts off, she asked me a bunch of questions, and this is the search for Max and Paul Spielman, and it talks about some of these, Amalia Bada and Leo Bada, Paul Spielman, the kind of stuff she needs to go through the search. And if any, I don't know if, people here, I don't know what their backgrounds are, but if there are people in your family that have interest in trying to find people that might have been displaced or killed or lost during World War II, this is one way to do it. Okay. So the next important event is the Stones of Remembrance. And when Fran, Joy, and I were in in Vienna in June 2012, we discovered, we actually turned out Joy was looking for a job. We went with her for a job interview. We wound up talking to some of the teachers there. They said to us, "Do you know anything about the Stones of Remembrance?" We said, "We don't know what you're talking about." They said, "Go to this place called Leopoldstadt," which is in the that's the second district. It has the highest, and now it's really the hipster place. It had the highest percentage of Jews living in Vienna, living in the Leopoldstadt second district. So we find out about the Stones of Remembrance. I go through some machinations. At the end of the day, I wind up going to Vienna in May 2014 to dedicate a stone for my grandmother. Now, for those people who are familiar with what's going on in Germany or Berlin, there's something called Stolpersteine. This is the Viennese version of Stolpersteine. Okay? Same, and these things are happening in other places in Europe too. Prague has them, and other cities have them also. So this is the one for my grandmother, Kaya Nichten. This is her Yiddish name, and basically it talks about she's moved into a place called a Sammelwohnung, which I speak about. You might have heard the term Sammellager, Sammelwohnung, basically a collection home where people were. There was a very organized staging. They kind of moved the Jews in closer and closer to the deportation areas, and Leopoldstadt was the deportation area. And they put them into apartments where one person lived, 12 people lived, and then eventually they deport them to wherever they deport them to. So this is this house. This is in German. The house was only 12 people. They crammed together collection apartments before the Nazis deported them, and only 12 of them survived. And by the way, depending on, it had a big impact on where you went to. If you went to Theresienstadt, you had a 30% chance of living. You went to some of these other places, forget it. So I talk about that presentation. Now, what happens, this is where one of the big serendipitous events occur. So I'm giving this presentation, and it's a real crappy day in Vienna. It's raining, it's miserable there. So it's like 20, a lot of people giving presentations, and I talk about the number of presentations, like maybe 30 presentations, more than 30. It was started at 10 o'clock in the morning, and then it was like 6 o'clock in the evening. A long day. And one of the presentations was given by a guy named Gunther Günzberger, who was an Australian. And then I gave my presentation, then we had a break in the action, and we're in Vienna, walking around in this Leopoldstadt, around the corner. And it turns out that I knew, through the research I did, which I talk about, that Max Spielman, one of my relatives, winds up going to Australia. I find that out through the International Tracing Service, because it traces all his movements until he went to Australia. So I go up to this guy and I say, "Listen, hi, my name is Irv Adler. I'm trying to locate a relative of mine. He's dead. He would be 113 years old if he was still alive." I said, "He's in, he lives, I knew what street he lived in, because my mother had these address books, and his name was in there, as of about mid-80s. And I said, he lives on this street." So the guy turns to me and says, "I know exactly where he lives. I live right around the corner." All right? So, what's the chances? And then he's on the street corner. He takes out his iPhone. And in Judaism, there's burial societies, which is basically how this temple began. In Judaism, it's very important how you bury people and take care of dead people. And they have something called the Hever Kedisha, which is basically the society for burying the dead. And he gets on his iPhone, and 5 minutes later, he shows me this picture. He shows me a photograph of the gravestone of Max Spielman. And it turns out that Max Spielman, he was married, but he never had any children. That's a whole story about Max Spielman. It's a very interesting story. And it turns out his wife has 2 nieces, and at least as of the date of this, which is what, 1998? Okay, sounds like they're still alive. So I go through a whole bunch of machinations with emails. I wind up contacting the cemetery. They put me in touch with the 2 nieces, and they don't believe anything I say. But anyway, after a couple of those emails, they kind of figure that I'm for real. And then they tell me that Paul Spielman, as of Paul, they still call Paul, they don't know his name is Shaul, or they did know, they didn't say it. As of 2006, he's still alive, all right? And he's in Israel. And he has a son whose name is Benny, who has been in the States since 2002, and who lives in Huntington Woods, Michigan. You know what Huntington Woods is? It's 3 hours from Fort Wayne. Okay, so he's been living 3 hours from Fort Wayne since 2002, and A, I didn't know who he was, I never knew his name, and I certainly didn't know where he's living. So that set up a whole bunch of things, and that's another whole story. I wound up finding very shortly thereafter, so I wound up speaking to Benny in June, and then we finally went through a little period because he wasn't sure who I was, but he tells me that and this is 2014, his father's alive. His father's name is Shaul, because they changed his name when he went to Israel. And, so this is the middle of June, this is like the end of June now, and in 2 weeks, his father, his mother, his sister are going to be in Fort Wayne in Huntington Woods. What are the odds of that? You know? Okay, voila. So here's the family, the Kansa Mishpucha. This is the family, and this is Benny, this is his mother, this is Shaul, this is me. This is Einat, his Benny's sister. These are all blood relatives, and this is her husband. And this is Shaul, and he's 83 at this time. Yeah, 83, because he turned 86 in July 2017. So he's looking pretty good. Oh, come back here. Okay, so now we go to October 2015. We took a trip to Vienna, and then I made arrangements to go see Shaul in Israel. I said, let's go to Israel. Okay, so we arrived in Tel Aviv airport. We're met by Shaul. We're met by his son-in-law, and that's it. They said we're going to go to my house. We're going to have dinner. Okay, great. We're going to have dinner. We'll meet 6 people, and maybe we'll meet 8 people. We met 26 people there, out of his family of 36 people. Okay. Now, let me tell you the miracle here, because this is important, and I talk a little bit about this. He was 11. So he grows up. He's in the Anschluss. He's born in 1931. He's 7 years old when the Anschluss occurs. He goes into the camps in 1942. He comes out of the camps in 1945. He's liberated. He goes to Theresienstadt. He goes to Auschwitz. His mother dies in Auschwitz. He goes to Birkenau. He's saved because his father apparently falsified something. From Birkenau, he goes to Buchenwald. His father dies in Buchenwald. He goes on a death march from Buchenwald to Mauthausen. And then he winds up being in Gusen, which is a very, very severe labor camp. And he gets liberated in 1945. He walks out of the camp, he has typhus, he falls down. It's an incredible story. That's how he survived. It's really quite that's only part of the story, okay? Then he's 14 years old, he comes to Israel. He's an agriculture worker. And then when he's 17, he joins the Palmach, which is the fighting force in Israel. He fights in every single major war of liberation, every one. And now he's retired, okay, because he's 86 years old. And so he loses his whole family. Until I spoke to his son, he had no idea that he had any other living relatives from his Viennese family. None, all right? He ends up in Israel. He winds up having a family of 36 people. 36 people. One guy comes to Israel, survives the camps, survives the battles, settles down, makes a life. I mean, it's just incredible. So these are pictures that were taken when I was going through. I have a big genealogical chart. I was telling him, this person is. I mean, his family had no clue. And I found out information about this one side of his family, his side of the family, which was my side of the family, my maternal grandmother's side of the family, that they didn't know very little about, because Shaul was 11 years old when he went to the camps. I mean, he had. I imagine by the time he was 6 or 7, he started to have pretty good memories. He remembered my mother, remembered my grandmother very well. Things were not so good during that time, so he didn't have. I know a lot more about what happened to him in Vienna than he does, essentially, as a result of my research. Okay, so this is basically what I found, and this is what I presented at the genealogical symposium at the Allen County Public Library. And there's 41 people here, and the only people I knew anything about were the ones in white. All right. So there's 33 people in this table that I had never heard of. Not that I didn't know about it, I never heard of them. And you can see a good number of them never made it. And then there may be a couple others that didn't make it that I don't know about yet. I'm still trying to reach us there. But here's my cousin Shaul is here someplace. Yeah, Shaul, and here's his family. And then I found cousin Lydia Mayer, and we've met, and I'll mention that a little bit. And also Annie Bettelheim. She lives in Vienna. Annie and Lydia live in Vienna, and Peter Spitz is alive, and he lives in Copenhagen, and hopefully I'll be able to see him sometime also. So. Okay, now that just brings us up to Molly Truxton. It's from 2015 to really this 2017, just doing more research and having more meetings with some of the family members. As I said, we met some people in Australia. I talk about that in more detail in the presentation. But last May, we went, Fran, myself, and Carol went with a group from Vienna to Molly Truxtonitz, and this is a little information about Molly Truxtonitz. There were trains that took 5 days. It was 1,320 kilometers, and when you got off the train, you were either dead before you got off or you murdered immediately when you got off. Okay. And there's 2 trains, but anyway, it's a killing field, basically. Molly Truxtonitz is a killing field. And when we were there, we had actually a memorial service for my grandmother, as well as 60 other people. So in Molly Truxtonitz, at least this location, this is a forest, there were 10,000 Viennese Jews that were killed at Molly Truxtonitz. They were deported, individual transports. The records are very clear. I know I have all those records. In fact, I have all the records of every transport in Vienna. The Gestapo did a very good job of keeping those records. So we had a memorial service, and after that memorial service, so that basically was the funeral service that my grandmother never had. We had it at Molly Truxtonitz. We had a rabbi at Cantor. We had, I think, 21 people, biggest group this person ever took. And said Fran, Carol, and myself were there. And then we went out and put these markers on trees to serve as temporary, if you like, gravestones for the people. But the stone of a remembrance, to a large extent, serves as the gravestones, permanent marker. And this person who set this meeting, these groups up, is working with the Viennese, with the Austrian government to try to get a permanent marker put in place with the names of all the victims. So the last thing I have here, so if anybody's interested, I'm going to give a presentation, basically my full presentation, the 16th at IPFW, and the title is what I mentioned before, that families that are lost and found, and tracing my Viennese roots. And well, anyway, I can't remember if I give you that information on a sheet of paper, but that's the date, November the 16th. It's IPFW, it's the wall. It's sponsored by the campus ministry. And the last thing I'll say is, I can pass this around. I have a book that has photographs, that has actually PDFs of the letters. Okay, I have all these letters. I made copies of them. I have the originals also. But you can see, if you want to see later on, I can just pass them around. And these are all current shrift. I don't have a Latin shrift, but Latin is regular primitive shrift, pretty much. So you can see what they look like. And I have 4 books of these things, one for every year. I don't know if you want to do this. Okay, that's it. Thank you. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them. If not, I'll, clear out.
And I was on a comparative physical education program to Germany, to Salzburg and Munich, and we had a day off. We went out to Dachau, and I don't know if Irv may or not agree with this, but Dachau to me is kind of a sterile place. It's been kind of prettified, but I was kind of interested in the behavior of people, so I decided. I was teaching middle school Blackhawk at that time. And in 7th grade social studies, you did different countries, and one of the countries was Germany. So I decided that I would do something about the Holocaust. And again, didn't know anything, so what did I teach? Everybody want to guess? Anne Frank, right? And I started off, I remember very clearly, it was right after the 1st of the year, 1st of January, we started that unit. And I said, we're going to talk about this event called the Holocaust. And the first thing I said was, 6 million Jews were killed. And I expected that these 7th graders were just going to erupt with anger, not a reaction. Absolutely. And what's wrong with these kids? So I, being a young teacher, I'm going to be very creative. I said, how many of you watched the Rose Bowl game? One of the kids opened up their hand. How many people attend the Rose Bowl? 100,000. I said, fill the Rose Bowl 60 times and kill all those people. Reaction from the kids? Not a thing. And it really bothered me. It took me a while to figure out that the numbers really don't have significance because of the enormity of the numbers. And therefore, the thing I think that's really critical is the idea of personal stories. And again, we're going to spend some time this afternoon looking at using survivor testimony. And I think Irv's story here and the contemporary tie-ins as well is just an example of that. And the number of times that Irv said, I didn't even know this person existed. And that's really, I think, almost the basic line of it there, that you don't know these people have existed. I think it's a very important thing to deal with. The stumbling stones that he talked about in Germany, they put these little blocks in the sidewalks, and it will say like the name of the person lived in the apartment at this address, deported on such and such a day. And the idea is that you're supposed to kind of stumble over them as you walk down the street. And I was in Berlin a couple of years ago, staying in a pension, and had to walk from the pension to the subway station was about, 5-minute walk. And I counted, there were 12 of those just on that one block in this one area of what used to be called West Berlin. And I think it really says something about this idea of personalization, and the key word here is this word, personalization. That there's our individual stories. At one time we had here in Fort Wayne, I believe it was 15 survivors. Almost all of them are gone now. One is still alive, living in Chicago, Doris Fogel. When you had the opportunity to meet the survivors, talk to the survivors, it was just an amazing experience. And we used to always say in programs like this, invite a survivor into your classroom. And we don't say that anymore because, as Irv referenced, the survivors are passing. The average survivor today is close to 90, I guess, or right around 90, I guess it is. And so we're trying to figure out ways, we're developing ways that allow us to keep going with the survivors, or the story of the survivors. And I think something like Irv is doing here is really very remarkable in that regard. So Irv, thank you for being in today.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Yeah. Let's just take a few minutes, if you want to go to the restroom or anything, and then we'll resume. I've got about 25 minutes, so let's do about 10 minutes, and we'll pick up with these third and fourth sections of the
Jews in Germany are at the least indifference to their treatment. In March 1938, German troops moved into neighboring Austria. Germany shredded another provision of the Versailles Treaty as Hitler's homeland was incorporated into Germany. It was a disaster for Austrian Jews. Within a year, the Nazis achieved in Austria what had taken 5 years to carry out in Germany. On November 9th, the Nazi Party orchestrated an outbreak of anti-Jewish violence throughout Greater Germany. It was a lawless onslaught that outraged the world and provoked criticism of the regime by many Germans. Jewish businesses that had already suffered anti-Semitic attacks were targeted for deliberate vandalism disguised as spontaneous public action. Party officials directed the SA, SS, and Hitler Youth to destroy Jewish shops and torch synagogues. Over 7,000 Jewish-owned businesses were vandalized. Germans named the violent attacks Kristallnacht, Night of Broken Glass, for the shattered windows of Jewish-owned stores that littered the streets. The nationwide violence damaged or destroyed more than 250 synagogues.
After Kristallnacht, I remember driving through Berlin and seeing the synagogues in flames and all the glass on the streets and the people huddled and depressed. They walked around like the victims, like the hunted.
German police filled the concentration camps with thousands of Jewish inmates. The SS released them only if they agreed to emigrate. But Jews faced increasingly restrictive immigration quotas in most countries and bureaucratic hurdles in Germany. A new law, issued in October 1938, required Jews to surrender their old passports, which would be valid only after the letter J was stamped on them. 2 months later, another law prevented the flight of capital owned by Jews when the economics ministry froze all Jewish property and assets. Many, who had the means and somewhere to go, tried to leave Germany. Some families sent their children alone to other, safer countries. They could not know how soon the world would be at war.
Questions or comments or whatever about that segment? Again, this is a short one, but a very important one. This process that moves things ahead in a very dramatic and very systematic and very intentional fashion.
I mean, I wrote down about the immigration,
Okay.
because they're like, you're in a concentration camp or like prison, you can leave if you're willing to leave the country, but then like in class this last week we talked about like the process of leaving Germany itself. They made it possible, or almost impossible, and then getting another country was even harder. So like you can leave, but not really. And good luck.
There's a lesson online on the museum website about that. Are you familiar with that lesson?
Yeah.
And what it is it has 2 documents. It has a list of the requirements to leave Germany and a list of the requirements to enter the U.S. It's interesting to note that at this time the U.S. has very restrictive immigration policies, and they're among the most liberal in the world. It's a really odd thing there. But for example, one of the things that you had to do to leave was you had to turn over almost all your money, those kinds of things. To get in the United States, the oddest one was you had to get a certificate of good conduct from the police where you lived. Well, how likely would it be for a German Jew to get a certificate of good conduct from the police in, let's say, Munich or something like that? This is called forced immigration. And again, it was really the key Nazi policy for quite some time. And in fact, it's believed that between 33 and 38, around 40% of German Jews actually left. Now, part of the problem was, in many cases, they went to neighboring countries, not imagining that what was going to happen later on. The Franks are the best example of that. They go to Holland, not imagining that Holland's going to come under German control. Went to Czechoslovakia, went to France. And so a lot of people who left Germany will eventually come under German control after the war begins. But this immigration is a very interesting one. The Evian Conference, there's a political cartoon there about it. 30-some countries were represented. None of them agreed to take many people. The only country that agreed to take virtually unlimited immigration, believe it or not, was the Dominican Republic. And there was a very few number of people who actually got there. Doris Fogel, who lived here in Fort Wayne, now lives in Chicago, left Germany at the age of 5 with her mother. Her father had died of natural causes. They wound up in China, because one of the places you could go without a visa was Shanghai. So she spent the war under under Japanese control in what is called the Lucknow Ghetto in Shanghai. Other things about this segment. Are we in the afternoon lull here, the post-luncheon lull here or something?
I couldn't believe that
Yeah.
they would just send kids away. I
Yeah.
mean, that would break my heart to
But if
send
you
my
think about it,
child off without anybody.
and many of them, by the way, go to England. There's something called the Kindertransport, where several thousand children were sent to England. Parents simply got to the point of understanding, or of sort of intuitively figuring out that where this was going, we don't know, but it can't be good. And so they were able to do that. The Kindertransport to England, probably the most notable example of this. And there's a very interesting book about that, The Children of Williston Lane, I think it's called, about some of the kids who get to England. It's a very interesting story about children from Czechoslovakia. There were several hundred children from Czechoslovakia went to England, and it was never known how this happened. And then, not too many years ago, it was discovered that a British businessman by the name of Nicholas Winton had saved all these children and never told anybody, including his family. And his family sort of found out about it by accident. And he just died a few years ago. He was like 107 when he died or something like that. And there's some very interesting materials about him now. There's a very interesting film about him now. And there was actually a thing held in England not too long before he died, where a lot of these children came back and met him. They'd never known about him. His name was completely unknown to the history until like 1997, 1998.
Is that the guy they had him like sitting in the theater
Yep.
in the front
Yep.
row, and then
Yep.
they introduced him?
Exactly.
He had no idea that.
Exactly.
There's a
A couple
video
hundred
on
people
Netflix.
sitting in this theater, and they introduced
Yeah.
him, and again, he was completely unknown until his family sort of discovered some things by accident. I think in the attic or something like that. It's a really interesting story. And again, there's a nice little film about it from him. And again, I see he just passed away very recently.
It's on Netflix.
Is it on Netflix? Okay. Nicholas Winton, Winton, and I forget the name of the film. But anyway, it's quite interesting. But yeah, the idea of giving up, but people got to the point of realizing we're probably not going to survive, or we don't know what's going to happen. So let's do what's possible. When you read about some of the stories of the deportations, I should say deportations of these kinds of things, it's a really traumatic. I mean, imagine you're 8, 9, 10 years old and you're put on a train, and you don't know where you're going. You don't know where you're going to wind up. I did an article a few years ago. There's an organization in Vienna has done a lot of tracing of Viennese people, and there was a story of one of the people that I did an article on a few years ago about that, and she wound up in England, and she was, I think, 12 or 13 years old at the time, and as soon as she gets to England, she's placed with this family that agreed to take care of her. She starts getting letters from her parents. Now, she's 12 years old at the time. You have to get us out. So all of a sudden, the 12-year-old child is responsible for the survival of her parents, and she wasn't able to do so. And it's a really interesting thing. There's the website. If anyone's interested, I can find the website. But all these kind of juxtaposed situations and so forth that come into play.
What about the St. Louis?
Yeah, St. Louis is interesting. And there's a lot of controversy about the St. Louis. The St. Louis was a ship, SS St. Louis, and there were 930, Jeff helped me with the number, 936, something like that. German Jews were on the St. Louis, and they were headed for Cuba. And they had what they thought were entry visas to Cuba. Well, in fact, the visas were invalid. Somebody was actually running a financial scam on these deals. So when they get to Cuba, the ship is not allowed to dock. Some people who are already in Cuba, family members, actually row out. And there's pictures of people in the rowboats talking to their families up on deck. The ship was not allowed to dock in Cuba. A few people were allowed to get off who had somehow gotten legitimate entry visas. They sail north to Miami. They dock off the coast of Miami for about a week or so. They petition FDR, who doesn't respond. They actually try to get into Canada, and the Canadian government doesn't respond. They go back to Europe. About a third of them are allowed to enter England, and those people all survive. The remaining 2/3, part of them go to Belgium and part of them go back to Germany
And to France.
and to France. And a lot of them eventually will be sent to the camps when those areas come under control. Later on, German control. When we get later on to the website, there is a series of 14 animated maps, and one of them is the voyage of the St. Louis with narration. It's kind of an interesting way to look at it. The dramatic stage play Ship of Fools was loosely based on the St. Louis. And St. Louis is not the only such ship. That's the one that's
This is a
very famous.
great book on
Yeah.
the St. Louis. It's called Alex's Wake.
Okay.
It's about two people who were on the boat and were dropped off in France. They were originally from Germany,
Yeah.
and they were killed in Auschwitz and Birkenau eventually.
A lot of them eventually wound up in camps. There was a considerable amount of research done at the Holocaust Museum, about 10 years ago now. And at the last I heard, they had tracked down, the researchers at the museum had tracked down all but about 3 or 4 of them. They still had not been able to locate exactly what happened to just 3 or 4 out of the 930-some people. And that was in 38, before Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht is the critical date here, folks. Kristallnacht is often defined as the point of no return. Up until 38, a lot of German Jews, maybe even a pretty good percentage of German Jews, said, you know, this is kind of bad, but we are Germans, we live in Germany, we're loyal, you know, things are going to get better. At Kristallnacht, all that ends. Anyone who's still in Germany after Kristallnacht realizes that the situation has gone beyond the point of reversal. But at that time, emigration slows down very dramatically, and less than a year later you have the start of the war. But Kristallnacht is Kristallnacht is the pivotal point in all of this. And you'll hear survivors say that in very, very blunt terms. You know, after Kristallnacht, we knew that there was not going to be a good end result to all this. Anything else? Jackie, too much good food here. Got that afternoon wall here.
We can also pull those.
Yeah, we'll pull the
lines
shades
down
up, make it a
now
little bit
if
easier to
those
see
are
the screen in the
bothering
afternoon.
This is the
Yeah.
point where students usually, if you are going to try a PBL method, this is where they start getting kind of angry, and then they start relating it to things that they deal with on a day-to-day basis, and they talk about how, you know, a lot of times it's why didn't we want to help, and then they start getting mad about why don't we want to help today, you know, and things like that. So prepare yourself if you do try a PBL method in the classroom with the Holocaust education. It's a lot of times you're treading water, and then you're researching things that night to come back into class with, because they come up with so many things that we as adults don't think about. Because when you relate it to the kinder transport, and you relate to, you know, Martha and Wait Still Sharp that risk their lives multiple times to go in and out of a country just to save 4 or 5 kids at a time, you know, those kind of things. And then your Hispanic population, this is where they start to really like relate what they're going through right now to something that now they're seeing on TV. A lot of them for the first time they hear about it, but they don't really dig into it. So
I think this is also a point where you can really talk about contextualization.
yeah.
Because it's very easy to say the U.S. should have done this, Australia should have done this, and so forth and so on, Canada, whatever. But you have to put it in the context, because what's going on in the mid-30s? The Depression. And the United States is trying to keep above water. And you know, there's a balancing point here. You know, students want history to have simple answers. And one of the things you always have to think about is there are no simple answers to complex questions. So when students say, well, you know, why didn't they let all these people come in? Well, the Depression, anti-Semitism, the remnants of World War I. If you look at American history after World War I, if you look at American history going into World War I, the United States doesn't want to go into World War I. Wilson gets re-elected in 1916 on what campaign slogan? Get us out of war, right? And so the United States goes into the war. The United States comes home from the war, and things are worse than they were before. So what do Americans say in the 1920s? If that's what being a world power is, we don't want anything to do with that. And so you have the isolationist thing. Congress passed in 1937 and in 1938 neutrality laws. Now, FDR figured out some ways to get around them with Lend-Lease. He and Churchill cooked that one up. You know, here, we'll give you a bullet, give it back at the end of the war, which is really what Lend-Lease was all about. But the mood of the country was isolationism, and the Depression, and anti-Semitism. You have in the 1920s the quota immigration laws designed to keep out people from Eastern Europe. Why Eastern Europe? We don't want communists coming over. I mean, there's a lack of logic there. The communists aren't going to leave countries that are becoming communist. But that was the logic of the time. And so you really have to contextualize all this to avoid students from saying A leads to B. A might lead to B, but you got a whole lot of A, 1, 2, and 3 subplots along the way. And I think that's a really important point to think about here. To give you an example of that, when the debate is going on a little bit later about refugee policy, and this is particularly after the war gets underway, and there's a lot of pressure on FDR to really take some very dramatic stands. Actually, this is during the immigration thing as well, about immigration. Look at how complicated the scenario is. The State Department was notoriously anti-Semitic, right from the very, very top. Notoriously anti-Semitic. Treasury, anybody know who Roosevelt's Secretary of the Treasury was? A man by the name of Hans Morgenthau. Hans Morgenthau was a banker. Well, who in the Depression liked the bankers? Hans Morgenthau was Roosevelt's next-door neighbor. So Roosevelt is accused, FDR is accused of cronyism by appointing his next-door neighbor to be the Secretary of the Treasury. And Hans Morgenthau was Jewish. So when Hans Morgenthau goes multiple times to FDR and says, you got to do this, FDR says, I'm sorry, Hans, I just don't have the political capital to do it. Plus State Department is saying don't. So you've got state fighting Treasury. So that complicates things for FDR.
I still think there could be a really good class discussion on the moral failure of our immigration
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah.
policy
Yeah.
while this was going on. Because when Kristallnacht occurred, it was front page news on the major American newspapers. The burning of the synagogues, and, the destruction of the Jewish businesses. So I think it could lead to discussion of maybe emergency measures in refugee programs. Because despite our depression, and it just seems like a huge moral failure that we weren't opening our doors to this plight of millions of people.
I think that's correct, and Carol raises a real interesting point. I think that's correct. I agree with you wholeheartedly, but there's one thing you have to throw in there. It's very easy for us to say in the security of this room 80 years after the fact you should have, when you're not there. So I think you have to, I agree with you what you said, but I think you have to kind of put it in that scenario as well.
Yeah.
You know, what would you, if you are a member of the Congress from, I don't know, Ohio, with a very high unemployment rate because of the Depression. So I think we have to have the discussion, also realizing that it's very easy to say should have, could have after the fact. Does that make sense, Carol? I mean, I think it's an interesting point to raise, though. Yeah, go ahead.
I can't think of the name of the book, but it was about an American reporter in France. who was arguing that we needed to do something, this is in their thirties,
Okay.
trying to argue that we needed to help the Jews to get them out of Germany, and it basically falls on deaf ears, and I can't think of the name of the book.
Well, I mean, Carol makes a good point earlier. Also, I mean, Kristallnacht is well known. I mean, you can go and look at the newspaper articles, front page the next day. In fact, one of them was shown in the film. So one of the things that sometimes comes out of all this is that the Western democracies didn't know. We knew. There was an article in Time or Newsweek in 1943. This is a little bit later, but just to give you the example, that talked about a place called Auschwitz. I mean, so there was no doubt that there was known all the way along the way. Again, you have to have a little bit of I don't want to use the word balance, but you have to acknowledge that all these things are going on. Somebody had something over here a minute.
I'm stretching.
Okay. But yeah, I think it's an important discussion to have. And if you can have the discussion, I think that's the value of posing the question without simply saying, sort of a blame putting at the same time, if that makes sense.
Well, there's an archive at the University of Minnesota, a Human Rights Archive, and they have a lot of documents from human rights organizations who are working with refugees in Europe in the 30s, and they're specifically sending people to help refugees of the Spanish Civil War.
Exactly.
And they had to pull several operatives back out of Europe because they were going to Germany and they were going to France and trying to help refugees there, but their donors, people who are giving them money to do this work, are sending them specifically to help the Spanish Civil War. So again, it's this idea of you don't have the clout to change what you're supposed to be working on.
And I think it's also interesting to note that if in the first part of this segment there was the parade, the films of the parade there, or several parades, German Jews were astounded by that because that wasn't supposed to happen in Germany. That was something that happened someplace else. German Jews felt themselves really very privileged because they weren't living in Poland. They weren't living in places where anti-Semitism was so strong. And there's almost sort of, if you listen to survivor testimonies about this, there's almost a disbelief. When things happened in Poland, when for example in Poland or Lithuania, people realized that they had been turned in by their neighbors. When a Lithuanian Jew realizes that my neighbor, the Lithuanian shoemaker, turned us in, they're not surprised. And that was part of living in Lithuania. Germans, at least for a while, when Germans realized my neighbor's the one who did it, or my neighbor's the one who's taking advantage of this, the person that I've employed for years is the one who's taking over my business when I'm kicked out of my business, at least for a while, they're astounded by this. Now, after Kristallnacht, that astonishment kind of goes by the wayside. But it's a really interesting dynamic to think about. I'll tell you one of the interesting ones today. Where are Jews in Europe moving to today? Jews from the former Soviet Union, when they can leave, where are they moving today? Germany. Because Germany is the one place where a lot of European Jews feel safe, because Germany is the one place that... Where's the ultra-right, the neo-Nazis, really strong today in Europe? France, but someplace else. Austria. Remember what Irv said? That there were more of a lot of the leaders of the whole process were Austrians? The percentage of Austrians who went in the SS was higher than the percentage of Germans in the SS. And it's interesting to note today that the real neo-Nazi movement in Europe today is in certain regional parts, not Vienna, but certain sort of regional, around the area parts of Austria. Eichmann was an Austrian. And I think you have to kind of look at that as a thing. It's an interesting dynamic. There were a much higher percentage of Austrians than Germans in the SS.
I think that's one thing that kind of caught me off guard in the video. When they said what had taken 5 years for them to do in Germany, it took them only 1 year to do in Austria.
Now, part of it's the fact that the regime's fully in place, but the Austrians bought into it.
Well, wouldn't the Austrians Wasn't Austria also a center for anti-Semitism?
Yes, yes, yeah.
For
very
a
much.
long time,
Yes.
well before Nazi Germany.
Much more so before Nazi Germany. And part of that has to do with the structure of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where you have all those different ethnic groups and all those different ethnic tensions that come up in Austria with the Austro-Hungarian Empire and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, anti-Semitism was always stronger, and obviously today. Somebody once said that the genius of Austria was in convincing the world that that Hitler was a German and Mozart was an Austrian, instead of the other way around. But yeah, that's a very important point. This idea that it moves. Now, part of it's the regime's totally in place, but the Austrians bought into it. When the Anschluss occurred, there was a plebiscite taken on joining Germany. And the Austrians were basically told, you either vote yes or we're going to take you over anyway. And the Austrians sort of used that as an excuse. Historians believe that 80% of the Austrian population welcomed the Anschluss. And one of the things that's when you look at Austrian history, even today, there's this sort of ongoing debate in Austrian politics. Is Austria the first victim or the willing accomplice of Nazism, of German Nazism? And I think you kind of have to almost lean to the other one. European elections are usually held on Sunday. That's sort of the way they do it. I mean, even today. And on the Sunday of the plebiscite, the vote to join Germany, the cardinal prelate of Vienna, in St. Stephen's Cathedral, the big, beautiful church in Vienna, gave a sermon that basically told the Austrians vote in favor of the Anschluss, and then he comes out on the steps of the cathedral and does the Heil Hitler in his cardinal's robes. He's basically telling Austrians, as good Austrian Catholics, this is what you should do. I mean, these are controversial issues. Imagine teaching this topic in very, very different settings. I said before, teaching the religious part of Concordia in the morning and Dwenger in the afternoon. But think about teaching this in Germany, in West Germany, as in opposed to the former East. During the communist era, West Germany, to a great extent, I think, came to terms with a lot of this. East Germany portrayed the Holocaust as a West German phenomenon. It's the West German government that succeeded the Nazi government, therefore West Germany is responsible for all of this. Imagine teaching this in Poland, where not only are 3 million Polish Jews killed, but another 3 to 4 million Poles are killed. And the fact that Poland was communist. Think about teaching this in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. In fact, let me give you a specific example of that. We said earlier that the invasion of Poland was both Soviet and German, and that it allowed the Soviets to take over Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And those countries were then occupied by Germany. They were then reoccupied by the Soviet Union in 1944 and did not become independent until 1992. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. By the way, there's a very easy way for your students to remember it. It's alphabetical. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, if your kids have trouble remembering the geography. Several years ago, the State Department and the Latvian Ministry of Education developed a program at the request of the Latvian Ministry of Education about teaching the Holocaust in Latvia. They sent 7 people, teachers and a couple of others, to the University of Iowa to research this, and then they sent them on to D.C., to the museum. And 7 of us from the museum, teachers working for the museum, worked with these Latvian teachers for a week. I was paired with a young lady who was a speech and communications major. And our goal was to prepare a curriculum, help them prepare a curricula for teaching the Holocaust in middle schools and high schools in Latvia. Interesting thing. When they were going around introducing themselves, each person said, you know, my name is so-and-so, I'm so-and-so. We got to one lady, She says, my name is so-and-so. I am the education director at such and such a museum. I am a Russian. 28% of the Latvian population today is Russian. They consider themselves displaced because of Russia no longer, Soviet Union no longer controlling Latvia. The one male with the group, and we're talking one day, he spoke a little English, and we were talking about teaching this in Latvian schools. And he said to me, he said, you know, my school is right across the street from where the ghetto was in Riga. And I thought, you know, so? And it finally dawned on me. What was he saying? My school is right across the street from where the German ghetto was for Latvian Jews in Riga. He wasn't telling me, you know, where the streetcars run in Riga. What was he telling me?
It was right here where you could see it.
More than that.
The people in that community experienced it, like, more deeply?
You're close.
How old is this person?
Well, he would have been in his 50s at the time.
How old was his school?
I don't know. I finally figured it out. He was telling me, you know, it's easy for you Americans to do this. I might have kids in my class whose grandfathers were in the Latvian SS. None of you are going to face that. I mean, think about teaching it in different places.
There's a great book called The Bloodlands.
Yes,
Oh,
exactly.
wow.
It's really interesting.
It's so good.
It's really interesting. But think about teaching that in different circumstances, yeah.
So this is a kind of, it's a little bit digression, but not quite. How soon after a giant event like the Holocaust does it actually start getting taught? Because I know there's like a golden rule that like it takes 10 years for it to be considered history, just so then we can understand all of the connections and whatnot. But like, so how long would after something like the Holocaust would it actually start being required to be taught?
Yeah, that's a good question. I hadn't intended to cover, but I think it's a valid question to ask. After the war, there was a tremendous amount of research done. Well, let's say the first 25 years, up until 1970, there was a tremendous amount of research done on the Nazi regime. Almost all of it on the leadership, Hitler, Goebbels, and so forth and so on. There was very little done on the Holocaust. There were 2 early books written on it. It wasn't even called Holocaust at this time, by the way. It was called The Great Catastrophe. And there were 2 major books written on in the 50s. One was published in England, one was published in France. Both were sold in the U.S. Neither of them got very much play. There was very little attention given to the Holocaust in the U.S. with 2 exceptions. Exception 1 was the publication of Anne Frank in English, and the other one was the Eichmann trial in 1961. Other than that, there really wasn't a whole lot of attention paid. That began to change with the Six-Day War in 1967. And the reason it changed was that American Jews look at what was happening to Israel in 1967, and you know, is something going to happen again? So you begin to get a little bit of it at that particular point in time. There was so little attention paid to it, that what's his name now? Can't think of his name. The first great Holocaust historian. Somebody help me. He was at Vermont. Help me, Jeff. Anyway, he was a survivor from Vienna. Came to the United States, got his PhD in history, and boy, that's going to bug me. It's one of those, you know. Anyway, when he was hired at the University of Vermont in like 1955, and one of the things you do when you hire into university, you have to establish a research agenda. He told his department chair that he wanted to focus on the Nazi program against the Jews. His department chair said, Raoul Hilberg, he said, Raoul, don't do that. There is no market for that. You will never have a career in academia. That was like 1955. He was the first great American historian of this topic. Beginning then in the 70s, you begin to have individuals teaching it. There was a lady named Leatrice Rabitsky in Cleveland who was one of the first ones to teach it in high school. So you begin to have bits and pieces of it. Most people who do it do the standard 3 days from Anne Frank's diary. You all remember an 8th grade language arts book, right? There were 3 days of Anne Frank's diary. What happened then, in sort of kind of an odd way, was several things. Number one, you had the 6-Day War and you had the Yom Kippur War, which really heightens the sensitivity of American Jews. But then you have, in 1978, some of you may remember this, most of you won't, the TV miniseries Holocaust. The first TV miniseries, what was the first TV miniseries?
Shoah?
No, not Shoah. Roots. Roots was the first one. A couple years later was Holocaust. Holocaust is bad history. I mean, every stereotype, every simplistic approach to it is there. But it's estimated like 35, 40 million Americans watched at least one or more of the shows. So all of a sudden people are thinking about this. At the same time, sort of, Irv likes to use the word serendipitous, at the same sort of serendipitous time, survivors are beginning to talk about it. And the reason survivors are beginning to talk about it in the 70s, when they hadn't before, is their children, the so-called 2Gs, like Irv, second generation, are saying, you know, Mom, you got to talk about this. So survivors are beginning to talk about this. Survivors are beginning to write about this in the 70s. The third thing that happens is that survivors begin to say, we have to keep this story alive. And so they begin to talk to their legislators, their congressmen, their senators, and so forth. And finally, in 78, President Carter signs a bill passed unanimously by both houses of Congress. Imagine getting the Congress to pass anything. I mean, they can't even agree what day it is. Establishing the United States Holocaust Memorial Council with its mission to develop an appropriate commemoration of the Holocaust. Now, nobody knows what that means. Most people assume it's going to be a statue someplace in New York City. Well, some survivors didn't buy that. And particularly a survivor who I'm going to show you in a little while, a man by the name of Ben Need, who we're going to look at some of his survivor testimony, didn't buy that. Ben was from the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And Ben and others began to say it needs to be something more. And the something more was a museum. So then what happens is, they started to raise money for the museum. And then the question is, where is this museum going to be? And everybody assumes it's going to be where? The Lower East Side of New York. Why the Lower East Side of New York? Because that's where all the Eastern European Jews live in New York City. And Ben and others, even though Ben lived in New York, Ben and others say, no, it needs to be in Washington. And not only in Washington, but where in Washington? Right off the mall. I mean, the political manipulations of this is absolutely amazing. Because why do you put a commemoration of an event that happened in Europe on the mall, or actually just literally about 150, 200 feet off the mall? So the agreement is made that the survivors will raise the money, $150 million, on land donated by the government, and then they give the museum to the government, which is exactly what happens. So all these things are kind of happening at the same time. People start teaching it. That's when I started teaching it at middle school, and then I didn't teach it for a while, and then when I went back to high school, I got back to it. So this is happening. Then you get to 93. And two things happen in December of 92, Schindler's List is released. And for those of you who remember that, I mean, that was and the museum opens, and it sort of explodes, not bad used a word, it sort of goes from there. So that's kind of the history of it. And it's very complicated. I mean, there's actually a book written about it, about all the political manipulations and all the debates, and who's going to be on the council, and what is it going to be? The original definition of victims was not to include the Poles. Why? Because Ben Mead and other Polish Jews said, we don't want to commemorate the Poles. They're as bad as the Nazis. I mean, Ben said that. I heard Ben say that once. So, I mean, you have all these kinds of things that come into play. And then, obviously, over time, the museum and all those different kinds of things. Films, books, all those different kinds of things come into play. Teacher programming, all kinds of things. It's an interesting story. It's a very interesting story, and I think it's a very, very tricky kind of, very tricky kind of story. Again, I'll talk about it a little bit more when I show you Ben here in just a little while. That has nothing to do with this topic here, but that's, I mean, we're a little bit off the side, but I think it's an interesting thing for you to understand how this plays itself out. Canada just a month ago finally decided to build some kind of a Holocaust memorial. Even though there are there were many thousands of survivors, particularly in Toronto and Montreal. There's a very large survivor community in Montreal. Obviously, most of those people are gone now.
David,
Yeah.
wasn't there something significant too in the late 70s with what happened in Skokie with the neo-Nazis?
Yeah, that's another one.
That
yeah.
started that whole...
If you know Chicago, the first suburb north of Chicago is Skokie. And I know a little bit about Skokie. My cousin's husband used to teach in Skokie. And Skokie at one time had one of the largest survivor populations in the world. There were over 60,000 survivors in Skokie. So in 1978, the neo-Nazis decided that they wanted to have a march. And where they're going to march? They're going to march in Skokie. So it gets into a big legal process, and the people in Skokie said, you know, I survived the Holocaust, I shouldn't see a swastika going down the main street of Skokie. And finally there was a legal settlement made that they could march like in the first 3 blocks of Skokie and so forth and that. There's actually a movie starring Danny Kaye, believe it or not, about the Skokie March. So that was one of the incidents. Neo-Nazi incidents, there was a man by the name of George Lincoln Rockwell who was a neo-Nazi, and he got some publicity. So all these things kind of, in an odd kind of combination, eventually lead to all these things that have happened. The biggest singular event, at least more recently, is Schindler's List. And Schindler's List is based on a true story, but there are a lot of historical inaccuracies in Schindler's List. Say that as, and the movie Holocaust. Elie Wiesel, the survivor, very, very famous survivor, blasted the movie Holocaust. But he also said if it takes that bad movie to get people interested, maybe it's worth it. And again, Schindler's List, you know, that, you know, 'cause you got Spielberg, you got, what, 8 Academy Awards or whatever it was. All those different kinds of things kind of come into play at the same time. The museum opening, the original intent, or the original idea was that the museum would have about 500,000 visitors a year. It runs about 1.7 million per year. It's been open now 25 years next spring, hard to imagine. So I mean, all those different kinds of things have kind of sort of oddly come together to do that. Your question about how long does it take history to become history, it's history right away. I mean, the fact that we ate lunch an hour ago is now history. But, but the idea of recorded history. And one of the things that's very, very tricky is that it takes a while to evaluate history. You know, presidential historians say that you can't really evaluate a presidency until 50 years after it's over. Well, that means we're just now should be evaluating Kennedy and Ike. And yet we evaluate, obviously, throughout. So that's a tricky question. One of the things we know, however, is that our view of history constantly changes because of new documentation. When Irv does this project with all this information about Vienna, he's changing the history of what happened in Vienna, not because the history changed, but because what we know about the history, what we know of the history, changed. And I think that's important. I think kids didn't understand that. History is not a static thing. We're constantly finding out new things, even about ancient history. You know, I'll give you another example with the Reformation last week. You know, Luther attacking the theses? Probably didn't. For a long time, historians believe that. Historians now say he probably didn't really tack it to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg. Now, that doesn't change what happened, but kind of changes our approach a little bit. So there are 2 different processes in history. There is falsification of history, Holocaust denial, but there's also revision of history. And revisionism of history is completely legitimate. It's when you go back and reevaluate what happened based on new, legitimate evidence. And that's what we're finding with the Holocaust. I mean, that's what Irv's doing. He's changing the view of what happened in Vienna because of new information that is now becoming available. Makes sense? I think kids need to understand that. You know, to kids, the history of the Civil War are those 9 pages in that textbook. That's all it is.
Unless they saw all of Ken Burns' documentaries.
Exactly. I had a student one time, I was teaching Snyder, and the kids were supposed to do a term paper. And this kid says, they give me their topics, and he says, I'm going to do the Civil War. And I said, okay, what part of the Civil War? Well, the Civil War. And I finally made up, I said, do you realize that 9,842 books have been written about the Civil War? He said, really? And I said, yeah. I said, now what's your topic? The Civil War. I said, go ahead and do the Civil War. I mean, because they think all of history is contained in that 4 pages on this, 3 pages on that, half the pages being filled with pictures. You guys know what I'm talking about with history books. And so I think kids need to understand that there's so much more. When we get to the museum website in a little while, that's one of the advantages, because you can have kids go in there, and Jeff has done a lot of this with Project Base. There's so much on there. Hundreds of survivor video clips. Thousands of photographs that kids can access and research and find out that this historical event, and by extension all historical events, have tremendous, you know, there's so much out there. Anything else on the segment here before we go to the last segment? The last segment is a little longer. It's about 12 minutes long, and it really covers the core of what happens from 39 to 45. And if you look at that, the discussion item guide there, with reference to the statement, under conditions of war and occupation, the regime could pursue its racial and military goals with more radical measures, and this Bergen's comment, no war, no Holocaust.
As the Nazi regime implemented its long-standing goal of territorial expansion, aggression against Germany's neighbors initially succeeded without encountering armed resistance. Hitler counted on the reluctance of Britain and Europe to intervene for fear of another war. The German occupation of Prague, capital of Czechoslovakia, left no doubt as to Germany's intent on military conquest in Eastern Europe. On September 1st, 1939, a massive German force invaded and conquered Poland within a month. It was the start of the Second World War. In April 1940, Germany occupied Denmark and Norway. In May, the German armed forces attacked France, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Belgium. In June, Paris fell, and France surrendered. The swift and unexpected victory over France avenged Germany's defeat and humiliation in the First World War. It propelled Hitler to a new level of popularity and trust among the German people. In June 1941, the German army, with more than 3 million soldiers, invaded the Soviet Union to wage a war of annihilation that targeted tens of millions of civilians. Under conditions of war and military occupation, the Nazi regime could pursue its political and racial goals with more radical measures. As German troops advanced into Eastern Europe, Germany's power extended over millions more Jewish inhabitants in the occupied lands, where German authorities could exploit existing anti-Jewish attitudes among local populations. Across Eastern Europe, German authorities forced those identified as Jews into tightly packed areas called ghettos. Separated from the non-Jewish population, Jews in the larger ghettos were imprisoned behind brick walls and barbed wire. The German drive eastward was cast as a crusade against Judaism and communism. In the Nazi view, two aspects of the same evil. German soldiers and police officials treated Soviet prisoners of war as subhumans, either shooting them or deliberately causing their deaths by exposure to the elements and by starvation. Millions died in German captivity. On the Eastern Front, racial political instruction was part of regular training for all types of German occupation forces. SS Chief Heinrich Himmler referred to the war against the Soviet Union in an address to his men. This invasion is an ideological battle and a struggle of races. Here in this struggle stands National Socialism, an ideology based on the value of our Germanic Nordic blood. On the other side stands a population of 180 million, a mixture of races whose very names are unpronounceable and whose physique is such that one can shoot them down without pity and compassion. In July 1941, Hermann Göring, Hitler's second in command, authorized all necessary preparations for the final solution of the Jewish question in the European territory under German control. As German military forces advanced, mobile killing squads advanced with them. The German army, military SS, and German police units took an active part in authorized mass murders. The Germans and their accomplices rounded up the victims, drove them on foot or in trucks to a killing site, often made them remove their clothes.
This is the only known footage of an
and shot them.
Einsatzgruppe.
Participants in the murders included local collaborators, especially police, in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Ukraine, and Belarus. The German killing squads and their auxiliaries murdered at least 2 million Jewish men, women, and children in mass shooting operations. Back in Germany, SS and police deported the remaining Jews to the occupied Eastern territories. In German-occupied Warsaw, the walled ghetto that German Jews entered as newcomers in 1942 was already a place of mass suffering due to terrible overcrowding, lack of sanitation, disease, and starvation imposed by the Germans. Despite all efforts of the imprisoned Jews to find ways of surviving and sustaining their communities, those conditions increasingly led to death for scores of thousands. Most vulnerable were the orphaned children. Originally, German occupation authorities established ghettos to concentrate Jews and separate them from the non-Jewish population. Later in the war, many ghettos served as staging grounds for the transportation of Jews to the east, euphemistically called resettlement by the Germans, who promised their captives better conditions and opportunities to work. People endured unimaginable suffering on journeys that lasted days without food, water, or toilet facilities. Many of the weak, the young, and the elderly died before reaching the destination. The Germans and their collaborators deported roughly 2.7 million Jews and others to killing centers in German-occupied Poland. At the largest of the camps, Auschwitz-Birkenau, transports arrived from all across Europe.
Transports were coming in every day. people with all kinds of different languages. Hungarian, Poles, Czechoslovakian, from Holland, from France, from Belgium, from Germany, from Italy, Russians, they were from everywhere.
My wife was somehow waving to me, and that's the last I've seen of her.
The smell, gas chambers. When I asked, when will I see my mother, I was shown the smoke. This is how I found out where she went.
It took a long time until I started to realize that we are condemned to die. All Jews are condemned to die.
Those whom the SS judged unable to work were killed, often within 2 or 3 hours of arrival. Those who could work would be used for forced labor under punishing conditions. When they could no longer work, they too would be put to death. In several killing facilities, exclusively designed to kill human beings on an industrial scale, camp authorities used poison gas to murder children, women, and men. At these killing centers, nearly half of all Holocaust victims died. The camps of Majdanek and Auschwitz were the first liberated as Soviet troops reached Poland. News of Majdanek's liberation in summer 1944 was met with disbelief. The New York Herald Tribune said, "Maybe we should wait for further corroboration. This sounds inconceivable." In April 1945, U.S. troops in Germany and Austria came upon concentration camps at Buchenwald, Dachau, Nordhausen, Mauthausen, and Ohrdruf. The soldiers saw the camps with their own eyes, and the truth was undeniable. General Dwight Eisenhower, commander of the Allied Liberating Forces, wrote, "The things I saw beggar description. The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were overpowering." In American movie theaters, newsreels made witnesses of thousands more. One commentator said, "To future generations, it must be told. Once man did this to his brothers. In the 20th century, there existed a civilization which for 12 years returned to barbarism." Shock permeated the camps as liberating troops tried to grasp what they had found. Soldiers did all they could to attend to the dead and to support the living. Those who survived faced the slow task of reclaiming their dignity and returning, somehow, to life. The Holocaust darkened the world's view of humanity and our future. As the world struggled to understand what had happened, a new word, genocide, was needed for these crimes. Crimes committed by ordinary people, from a society not unlike our own.
Questions or comments or whatever about that segment? Obviously a very different segment. We make one comment. There are a couple of short clips in there of bodies. There's no other way to say it. You have to be really careful there. And I think that the film does a nice job of doing that. One of the things we know is that sometimes teachers, to try to impress, excuse me, try to impress this on students, show a lot of pictures of the bodies. You need to stay away from that. There's a shock value involved that I think is very, very marginal. And I think it borders on an almost abusive kind of thing. I think students, particularly high school students, need to see a little bit, but not a whole lot more that's in there. Again, there are 3 or 4 clips there, but not a lot more than that, and certainly not lower age groups. I think you really have to just use some very good judgment there, because you don't want to get to a circumstance where it becomes, on one hand, a horror show, or on the other hand, somehow kind of attractive in sort of a negative sort of way. So I really urge you not to do a lot of that. I mean, I've heard of circumstances where teachers will just bring in and show slide after slide of pictures of that. And I don't think that's a good way to approach it, quite frankly. I remember one time I was doing a presentation on the teaching guidelines, and one of those is avoid the use of graphic images. So I put a picture up explaining that, picture of the graphic images. And we started talking about it. And about 10 minutes later, one of the teachers said, "Would you please take that picture off?" I'd forgotten that I still had it up there. It was affecting the teacher that much. So I think you have to, what's the word I want to use, be very judicious in how you approach that. Again, I think kids need to see it, but certainly not be bombarded with it, because I think it can have a very negative effect on the whole kind of, on everything that you do there. Any questions on that segment, or any historical facts, or how to use that segment, or anything like that? It's a sobering segment.
There's one of the scenes, and it said the soldiers tried to help the living as much as they could. And I believe it was from Gerda Weissman Klein's book, All About My Life.
Yes.
When she points out they essentially had to be weaned back onto food.
Yeah.
Because they've been without it for so long, their bodies couldn't process it.
There were actually some cases where, when the American soldiers went into the camps, the first thing they did was to try to feed people. And what did they carry? They were carrying chocolate bars. Well, chocolate is essentially a poison. I mean, that's why the reason you don't give it to dogs and that. And so the soldiers started giving people chocolate bars, and it actually poisoned them because of the toxic nature of some kinds of chocolate. So yeah, doctors had to create a way to treat starvation to an extent they'd never seen before. So they started with broth, and then they'd add a little bit of rice, and eventually get people back on reasonable diets. But many people died after liberation because of the after effects of that. I mean, physicians had never seen anything like that before, and obviously not on that scale. Gerda Weissman Klein, whom Jane just mentioned, very famous survivor. She's still alive, lives in Scottsdale, Arizona. We had her here for the mayor's prayer breakfast several years ago. Her testimony, there's a film, All About My Life, and there's also, there's the book All About My Life, and then there's a film called One Survivor Remembers that I think is probably on YouTube. It's about 35, 40 minutes long. She has a very interesting story, as do all survivors. She was actually liberated by a German Jew who had come to the United States, became an American citizen, and joined the U.S. Army, and she was actually liberated by him, and they wound up getting married. And they were married for close to 60 years before he passed away a few years ago. But just a remarkable, remarkable story. She was from Poland, liberated from Czechoslovakia, from a bicycle factory in Czechoslovakia. And again, she's still alive. She's 93, I think it is, and lives outside Phoenix. Other questions or any questions or comments, historical points, use of that segment, anything like that? So how would you use the film in general in your classroom situation? Or would you? Josh?
We use it as a starting off point. Usually giving as an introduction to the topic to make sure everyone has at least the basic understanding. And the very first part of it, I didn't mention it when we did the first segment, was that introduction of everything being positive and then it going downhill, and especially what we teach with eugenics.
Exactly.
It was thought to be a very positive thing, and then it turns very, very dark.
Yeah, let me make a comment on two things Josh said. First, Irv mentioned the term fin de siècle, the end of the era, the so-called end of the year in 1900. The 1900 was a very dramatic year in Western European history. If you go back and look at history further back, the Enlightenment comes along in the 1700s. And the Enlightenment, as you're all aware, was the idea of progress through logic, through reason. I mean, that's what the Enlightenment is all about. And in the mid-1800s, the idea of the Enlightenment, the idea of progress changes, and it becomes inevitable progress. And then, as the technological age, the manufacturing age, the industrial age comes along in Western Europe and the United States, it becomes inevitable progress through technology. Technology was to be the thing that was to create this sort of golden era of the human experience. And that's what people believe in the late 1800s, where you have, for the first time ever, you have a surplus of food in many countries. You begin to have medical care. You begin to have the expansion of democracy, travel, communications, the telegraph, the telephone, the automobile, and all these kinds of things. And so there is this essential belief in inevitable progress through technology. And I'll get to what Josh said about eugenics in regard to this in just a minute. Well, World War I shatters that. Because what makes World War I so destructive is the use of technology. I mean, you think about it, the airplane. Nobody imagines when the Wright brothers make that flight of, 253 feet or whatever it was, that 10, 12 years later, this new thing called the airplane is going to be used to drop bombs. The tricky one there is that one of the things that makes World War I so destructive is the same thing that made America the breadbasket of the world, something called barbed wire. Barbed wire fences off the plains and turns America into this huge production of food place. Barbed wire is one of the things that makes World War I so destructive because it was strung between the trenches. That's what makes the no man's land so bad. So this idea of inevitable progress through technology is shattered by the very thing that was supposed to create it. So you go into the wasteland. You're all familiar with T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, the poem. Europe is a wasteland after World War I, figuratively and literally. And then you have this coming along 25 years later as sort of the ultimate extension of that. And when Ray Farr says in the thing, a return to barbarism, I think that's a bit dramatic, but it's also true. Now, the idea of eugenics, if you think about the word eugenics, literally means what? Good birth. E-U, good. The idea of eugenics was part of this idea. The idea that you could deliberately create a better human being. Now, eugenics really gets its start in the United States, Scandinavia, England, Belgium, Germany. And it's seen as a very positive thing. And this is, I think, what Josh was alluding to a minute ago. It was good. You make sure that the right people have kids and the wrong people don't have kids. It's called positive eugenics. You didn't kill people, you just prevented people who shouldn't have children from having children, a lot of times for genetic reasons. And if you go back and look at genetics in the United States, anybody know who some of the leading believers in the United States in terms of eugenics were in the early 1900s?
Teddy Roosevelt.
Teddy Roosevelt was one.
Margaret Sanger.
Margaret Sanger, the developer of birth control. Woodrow Wilson. There's actually a letter once called the Davenport Letter that Teddy Roosevelt wrote to a man by the name of Charles Davenport, who was the president of the American Eugenics Society, and said maybe someday we'll have a way to make sure the right people have kids and the wrong people don't. There was, those of you who've been to IU, those of you who know IU, what's that little body of water that's about this wide that goes right through campus by 10th Street? The Jordan River. Anybody know who it's named for? David Starr Jordan. David Starr Jordan was the president of IU. He was a leading eugenicist. He left IU to become the first president of a little unknown college in California called Stanford. There right now is a debate about, there's a middle school, believe it or not, in Palo Alto right now that is in the process of changing its name from Jordan Middle School to something else because somebody's dredged up all this thing about Jordan being this eugenicist. But it seems to be very positive. These are all things that come out of this era of the Enlightenment, this idea of reason leading to a golden age. It collapses with Nazi Germany. And I think one of the important things to note also, and we mentioned this earlier, is the fact that the Nazi leadership, I mean, just discount Hitler on this one, okay? The Nazi leadership was by and large very highly educated. Goebbels is a PhD. Heydrich, who was in charge of the death camp system before his assassination in Czechoslovakia, a skilled concert violinist. Some say he could have been world class if he really had wanted to be. Doctors, lawyers. I mentioned before, we talked about before the Wannsee conference, 15 people attended Wannsee, 9 were PhDs, MDs, or JDs, lawyers. 9 out of 15 doctorates. That's sort of beyond the normal percentage in a population. And so I think we have to acknowledge that. We tell kids, what about education, folks? There's a reason every one of you are in education, I hope. What do we tell kids about education? It's good for you. I think we can argue it to a certain extent here when we see what educated people did. If the Nazis were madmen, we can excuse the whole situation, or at least ignore the whole situation. Because they're mad and we're not. But they weren't. Now, were there sadistic ones? Sure. Were there ones? Sure. But by and large not. They were bureaucrats, they were thinkers, they were ideologues, they were highly gifted people in many cases, doctors. Mengele, the so-called angel of death, was an MD and a PhD. He was, by all accounts, a very gifted physician. Aaron White, Josh's teaching partner, has been on a couple of study tours to Europe dealing with the Mengele situation. Finest university system in the world at the time. In probably the most sophisticated country in the world at the time, at least going into World War I, Germany was. It's interesting. It's a really interesting circumstance. Okay, any questions about, again, any of the technical, not technical aspects, historical aspects of the film? I would urge you to watch it multiple times. Go back and kind of pick out the details and research them. You can research them on the museum website. Because what you're going to have is what we had here. Kids are going to ask really sort of far-out questions. There's nothing wrong with that. So you really have to know your history in order to use it effectively, or otherwise you're going to have a lot of I don't knows, which that's okay for a while, but after a while it's not okay. But I think it's useful to, again, introduce, if you can only do a couple of days, it's a useful way to do it, more so than the book, obviously, the textbook, and for an introduction to more developed. Jeff?
Yeah, when, I don't, what year it came out, 2012 or 14. 13 or whatever.
13.
And he happened to be in the classroom, so I tried it halfway through my curriculum,
yeah.
And it didn't have as much impact as it did at the beginning.
Yeah.
because I think, see, we focus on knows and need to knows, what kids have prior, and then what kids want to know. And the video kind of allows them to put a visual with just a concise conversation piece. And then when we do get to that part of the curriculum, then they have this, oh yeah, and then they kind of make connections. So it was better when we used it in the beginning than it was in the middle. And then remember we tried it at the end, and that was even worse. So it's a good way to kind of start the conversation of Holocaust education more than it is probably either concluding
I think its biggest value is the short-term overview, or as you say, the introduction. I think those are the two real values of it. And maybe a third one be if you really get familiar with it, so you know where different places are. So maybe when you're doing a particular discussion, you only go to maybe a 3-minute segment or something like that, where you kind of index it on your own and figure out, these 3 minutes will really help me on this particular.
Yeah, and our language arts teacher helped me create like a prompt that I could use the video for a language arts class if I ever needed to tie that to it. And it was a good tie-in because they had to write an essay based on a video. And that's, we watch videos and we take notes and we write ideas. No, the kids were more entrenched in, I found one person that I connected with on a video, and then I went and researched a little bit more and did their own essay based on just what they saw on there.
All right, let's take a quick break, and then we're going to come back and look at using the website and various features, particularly the maps and the oral histories on the website.